There are cars that transcend time for many reasons. Perhaps they broke new ground in design, or maybe they innovated technologies on the racetrack. Maybe they were attached to famous people or events. Then there are those cars that seem to actually represent something far larger than themselves. Machines that even in their own time seem to have meaning and inspiration to an entire part of the car culture. I'm here to tell you about one of those today. It was at times called the greatest streamliner in Bonneville history. It was at times called the Herda and Kegel Streamliner, but was most famously known as the Herda, Knapp, and Mylodon Streamliner. What this car stood for when it debuted to the world at Speed Week 1962 was perhaps the most highly engineered, most well-constructed homemade streamliner to that point in history. It was a hot rod, blown Hemi and all, but it was a world-class piece of engineering and construction, dynamic in its performance, amazing in its appearance, and it would become the fastest single-engine car in the world to boot. This is that car's story. Of course, in typical fashion, when I dove into learning about the details and genesis of the streamliner that became Bob Herda's land speed racing legacy, I figured that looking at its performances on the salt year over year would be interesting enough, and that would be pretty cut and dried in the storytelling department, but of course, I was wrong. The central character in our story is a man named Bob Herda, and we're going to meet him in 1952. He's from Portola Valley, California, which is a quiet area outside of San Jose and not too far south of San Francisco. He's graduated from USC, holding a degree in aeronautical engineering, and he's quickly rising through the ranks at Hiller Helicopters. This is a company based in Palo Alto, California, and he is also an inveterate hot rodder and has been since he was a kid. If there's one thing we're going to learn about Bob Herda in this video, is that he was in possession of one of the most coolly headed, patient, and deliberate approaches to speed at Bonneville as anyone in history. Inspired by what he had read and learned of the first outing of Bonneville Speed Week in 1949, Herda decided he wanted to race on the salt, and not just in anything, but in the most exotic thing that there was, a streamliner. He began constructing his car in 1950. By 1952, he was on the salt himself, learning his ropes in a roadster. Incidentally, a roadster that gave him mechanical fits, and he only went 124 miles per hour that year. The car he was building at home was called Attempt 1, and this was not a joking name. It was, as we'll learn, Herda actually telling the world that this was his first attempt at a streamliner, not his last or only. This was a starting point. In 1953, the car was completed and ready to race. Herda, as he would do throughout his career, would team up with partners to run his race cars. In this case, the 1953 group was Herda, Kramer, and Fuller. Fuller being a local trucking company operator and a racer himself named Dana Fuller. He was the guy that ponied up the money for the 671 blower that would run in the front of the engine in this car, which just so happened to be a 442 cubic inch version of a 392 Hemi. The engine was built by Doug Hartlett, who was a pioneering drag racer and land speed racer of this era. Now, as we can see, the car is a pretty amazing piece of home-built engineering, and for a very early 1950s machine, it was advanced and beautiful. Herda welded up the entire chassis himself, as well as did the majority of the bulkhead-style construction you see here. The body was parts aluminum and parts fiberglass. The car was two-wheel drive, at least at first. Now, in doing research, some articles say it was four-wheel drive, but at the time you see these photos, and at the time we know the car was on the salt, Attempt 1 was two-wheel drive. Now, by the time Attempt 1 was retired, I'm not sure if it actually was four-wheel drive, but I have no photographic evidence to prove that it was, despite what some reports say. These images of both Attempt 1 in the garage and on the salt are pretty amazing. Like all of Herda's cars, they evolved over time. You'll notice that the shape of the nose changes in some of these images. Many of the small adjustments were made mechanically. And while the car didn't do a really lot to brag on before 1956, it did get better each year and every time it came to Bonneville. Eventually, it would be the Herda and Hartlett Streamliner, and we would really hit its stride in 1959, running just a touch over 250 miles an hour and earning the trophy in the B Streamliner class. Now, in this case, he actually outpaced the famed Summers brothers by some 45 miles per hour. Bob Herda was aware of one really important thing regarding Attempt 1, and that was the fact that the car had basically gone as fast as it was going to go. Now, this wasn't a 1959 revelation. It was actually a thought process that began back in about 1956 when he started going on, yes, his second Streamliner, armed with everything he had learned from the first one. Now, it should be noted that Bob Herda didn't just race the Salt. He had a Porsche Super Speedster 1600 that he actively road raced, and that car was sold at auction recently for more than $350,000. He also had a Huffaker Special road racing car that he drove a lot as well, and if you're familiar with the name Joe Huffaker, you should be. He built Indy cars and sports cars and was one of the best builders really in the United States, if not the world, for a period of time. His early Huffaker Specials were fast for the day, and Herda had one of those as well, racing the wheels off it with small block Chevy power. But after that interlude, we go back to the high-speed stuff. To be absolutely clear, Bob Herda ran the Attempt 1 car until 1960 and had been working on his next evolutionary step simultaneously in order to have it rolling to the Salt by 1961. The second car was not completed for racing, but it was intact and it was capable of being brought through the technical inspection at Bonneville for the first time. If you've never seen it or experienced it, even in the modern day, Bonneville Tech for fast cars is more intensive than nearly any other technical inspection of any racing organization on the planet. Cars like Bob's would need to be looked over by a multitude of inspectors, and they'd all have to sign redundant sheets agreeing with what they saw being legal. So the idea of bringing a car to the Salt not to race but to go through tech is not foreign. It wasn't foreign in 1961, and it's not foreign when I make this video in 2024. Now, there are some places that say he actually drove the car down the Salt with no body on it in 1961, but I have no photographic evidence for that, and I think he was simply there for the tech inspectors to sign off on what he had built so he could continue on with the project. There really isn't any mention in any of the 1961 Bonneville coverage of this car or the fact it was even there, and I can understand that. They had limited pages in these magazines and wanted to devote them to the people actually running down the racetrack, not getting their welds and mechanicking abilities scrutinized. I have to tell you this to set up what happened in 1962. When the 999 B Streamliner of Bob Herda and Doug Hartlett rolled onto the Salt in 62, people were gobsmacked. This car was gorgeous. The bare metal body, sans paint, looked like something out of a futuristic movie. Now, there have been plenty of big-powered Streamliners. A few dozen had been built to this point in history, but none of them, not a single one, looked like this, and none of them were built in the fashion that this car was because of Herda's methodical, measured, and patient approach. This one car would be the speed gift that kept on giving for years. 7 of them, to be exact. So here's where we stop and get into the details of the car. And we're going to get back to the romping, stomping speeds in a couple of minutes, but you need to understand the nature of this thing and how truly gifted Herda was as a thinker, a doer, and an engineer. When Bob Herda decided he needed a new and improved Streamliner to replace Attempt 1, he went to a natural place for an aeronautical engineer to get advice for a project like this. The lunchroom at Hiller Helicopters. Surrounded by young, adventuresome, and talented engineers, these guys are all gearheads. They talked about concepts, they explored and saved ideas, and threw many in the trash. The pile of napkins containing drawings and math must have been epic each and every day they got together at lunch. Months of planning went on, and eventually every part of the car that would be built was blueprinted and specifically designed down to individual brackets. There was one overriding principle that Herda had in this whole project, and it's 3 simple words. Simplicity equals reliability. Per acclaim in popular hot rodding magazines feature on this car, by the mid-1960s, 75% of all Streamliners constructed for Bonneville had been wrecked in aerodynamically linked crashes. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. It was their words, not mine, but that's a stunning claim. As you likely understand, the aero on this car was not a guess. In fact, this was probably the most highly scienced-out car in the history of Bonneville at the time of its debut in 1962. Herda was also a forward thinker and designed his chassis with growth potential in mind. The center of the car was crafted with what amounted to an inner and outer chassis. The inner chassis could be removed to expand the central area of the car, allowing 2 engines to eventually be installed. The plan was to take the machine with 1 engine as far as it would go, but eventually 2 engines would be needed to run the really huge numbers he envisioned. And he wanted this car to run 400 miles an hour plus, but it would be done in a methodical, patient way that Bob Herda approached everything about this car with. Building the whole chassis by himself, Bob gas welded every joint, and it looks amazing. He used seamless chromoly 1.5-inch diameter 063 wall tubing for the mainframe, and inch diameter 049 wall tubing for all the uprights and other bracing that made up a 200-pound chassis. He chose 2-inch aluminum T-stock to make up the skeletal structure to support the body. That material is easily formable, it's lighter weight, and as you can see here, it did the job perfectly. Note the construction style difference between this car and Attempt 1. The first car was very much built in the bulkhead style of airplane construction. This one is far more tube chassis space frame built. It again reflects the evolution of Herda's approach and what he learned running on the Salt with Attempt 1. In features and commentary about the car in magazines, journalists and racers alike fell all over themselves about the flawless workmanship, engineering, and superbly executed details. And listen, we haven't even gotten to the good stuff yet. Having seen Mickey Thompson and others employ four-wheel drive successfully on the Salt, Herda made this adjustment for his own car. The front and rear axles were their own magnificent examples of engineering and execution at work. Up front, a Halabrand V8 straddle mount center section was used. Said center section was justified to the extreme left of the car for reasons we'll discuss in a minute. Ford rear axle bells were attached to the center section, and the tubes that would extend the housing in either direction of unequal lengths were then welded to them. Now, on the ends of the axle were Jeep hubs and kingpin bells, and yes, Jeep Rezepa joints. These are things that were designed for Jeeps that went about 50 miles an hour at the time, and the goals of this car were to go 400. The gear ratio was 327 in the front axle, and the axle itself was located with a pair of hairpins on the left and right side. Now, the total travel was limited to 1 inch vertically. Homemade springs, which varied from 280 pounds all the way up to 400-pound springs, were used in different times over the years, depending on conditions. A pair of Columbus tube shocks were mounted on the axle itself to dampen it. In 1961 and 62, an industrial steering box was used out of some sort of machine, and Herda didn't like it. Eventually, he got a steering box out of a Dodge Dart, a recirculating ball-style unit, and he moved it, mounting it on its side. He then designed all the linkage to allow that side-swinging arm to control the steering of the car in perfect fashion. Now, in the rear end, things go from cool to downright amazing. A quick-change housing with a 327 gear ratio serves as the foundation for one of the neatest setups I think I've ever seen, especially for the time period of this car. Now, the center section was solid mounted to the chassis. Forward axle bells were mounted to the housing, and a flange was attached to the area where the axle tubes would normally attach to the bells. Now, after that, 2 specialty-made outer hubs are added. The inner end of those hubs used a ball and socket joint that was employed by pre-1949 Fords on the ends of their drive shafts to allow articulation in the suspension. At that point, Ford didn't use traditional U-joints, they used this ball and socket setup. But by using that as the interior mounting point to the center section, Bob Herda had built his own swing-arm rear axle from old Ford parts in his own beautiful mind. A pair of trailing arms and torsion bars made from scratch, of course, with a pair of Monroe shocks were in charge of controlling the movement of the axles, which were again limited to about 1 inch of travel. Every single thing about the rear end, except for the center section and the shocks, were made by the hands of Bob Herda, including the axles themselves inside the housing. On the back of the axle was a scratch-built transfer case that Herda, once again, had made from scratch. This took power off the back of the axle and through a set of gears, sent it to a drive shaft that ran up the left side of the car. Now that left-mounted center section up in the front would line up with the left-mounted output of the transfer case in the rear, and voila, we are ripping along a very straight four-wheel drive setup with 1 solid axle in the front and 1 swing-arm axle in the back. The long drive shaft was supported by a plethora of carrier bearings to keep it straight and to minimize the chance of an overspeeding failure. With the tall wheels and the tires that were inflated to 150 psi, the final drive ratio of the car was 1.56 to 1. Now, incidentally, those tires that Bob ran grew 1.4 inches in diameter at 300 miles per hour. This car has a larger and more kind of spacious cockpit than many of the cars of that day you'll see people stuffed into. There were gauges and a brake handle and a shifter that was there to start with. We'll get more involved in that evolution in a couple of minutes, and that's kind of what occupied the real estate in there. The machine had 1940 Ford brakes on the rear end only and used an 8-foot parachute that was the primary stopping means. Now, that parachute was not deployed in the normal way with a cable. Of course not. This is Bob Herda we're talking about. Instead, it was electronically deployed using a 24-volt GM aircraft solenoid switch. The car had a 24-volt battery mounted behind the driver, and the craziest part, maybe, of this entire car is that Bob Herda had a video camera, a government surplus camera he bought for cheap, mounted behind the driver's area. Now, when the car started, it would be turned on and recorded the gauges on every run. After the event, they could go back and go home and take the film out, get it set up, and actually watch the runs back to read the gauges and kind of understand what was happening in the cockpit as Bob was concentrating on steering the car. It would tell them things like if the aerodynamics were correct, if the acceleration rate was right, how good a job Bob did shifting it on time. How awesome and forward-thinking is that, to have this technology in a car more than 60 years ago? The machine also carried something else just behind the driver. A tank of pure oxygen was located to the left of the engine, and it was to be used by Herda as his fresh air supply when the car was going down the salt. He wore an open-face helmet and had an oxygen mask attached to his face. Why did he use pure oxygen? I'm not really sure about that. And sadly, this might have been the only thing that Bob Herda made a miscalculation on when building this car. Now, the body of the car is, of course, stunning. The shape of it is alluring. It makes you look at it, makes you stare. And Bob Herda designed it, but he also built the buck that was used to form it. With all of the work conversations he had had and all the design conversations he had had with fellow engineers, there were a few different looks debated over, and the initial one chosen actually didn't have a tail as the finished product did, but it also shows that Bob was capable of making changes really at any point during the life of this project. In terms of things that are invisible to the naked eye, the body's center of pressure and center of gravity are in the exact same place, located 58 inches behind the front axle. The car has 11.4 square feet of total frontal area. It is 19 feet 2 inches long, 66 inches wide, and 38 inches tall at the canopy, with 55 inches to the height and top of the fin. The fin, which is also part of the gas tank, has a surface area of 6.5 square feet. The wheelbase of the car is 111 inches, and the car sits 5 inches off the ground in the front and 6 inches off the ground in the back. The construction of the body was an arduous task, and one that Herda did not shy from. Don Borth, whose hands have graced some of the most iconic hot rods and race cars in history, was chosen to lead this part of the project, and Bob Herda delivered him the buck. He spec'd out 3003 H14 commercial-grade aluminum as the material to construct the body from. California Metal Shaping was hired to begin the rough forming of the panels, which they did. For the next 10 weekends, Bob Herda drove 400 miles each way to Borth's shop to work side by side with him in making the finished body. They fitted panels, welded them together, and created the incredible form that arrived in bare, shining metal to Bonneville. Not only was the car beautiful topside, it was also completely seamless and basically sealed from beneath for the best aerodynamic efficiency possible. So now you know about the total mechanical layout of the car, minus a couple of things that we're going to pick up from this point forward. Before we went on our mechanical interlude, it was 1962 and the car was being given a hero's welcome. As it turned out, this was not the only unique, curvaceous, and beautiful car to hit the salt that year. In fact, it was the kickoff for another pretty interesting moment in Bonneville history. The second car that debuted was called the Redhead, or as it was nicknamed on the salt, the Coke Bottle. Now, this car was basically a dragster chassis with an amazingly interesting body on it, but it was fast, and for the next few years, the two cars would battle each other for the B Streamliner honors each and every time they got together on the salt. Eventually, the Redhead would concentrate on smaller displacement categories, but understand that car that debuted in 1962 was raced into the 1990s at Bonneville. I have made mention of Bob Herda's changing partnerships over the years with his race car, and the end of one partnership would come in 62. It was the last year to run one of Doug Hartlett's engines. Bob Herda went 255 miles an hour on a 10% load of nitro with that blown Hemi. Now, the problem wasn't the engine this year, it was the transmission that failed the car. A Borg-Warner T85 3-speed was actually the unit chosen in the first iteration of this machine, and it was a reasonably strong original equipment 3-speed manual transmission in production cars, but it was hating life with a blown Hemi on just a little nitro in front of it. Popular Hot Rodding's coverage of that meet talks about the transmission woes and how it sent the car packing and left them disappointed, especially in the face of the performance of the Redhead. For the 1963 return of the car, there were some changes. For starters, the bare metal body had been drenched in 1954 DeSoto Ensign Blue. This metallic blue paint job really made the car look classy. It appeared as nice or nicer than any of the other stuff the rich European guys were chasing records with. This was a hot rod to be admired, to be respected, and to be impressed with. Maybe. Clark Cagle was hired by Herda to be his engine guy. The car was now the Herda and Cagle Streamliner, and with Cagle's power, everybody was expecting a massive battle with the Redhead for the B Streamliner honors that year. Taking the record from the 270s up over 300, the Redhead set a 302-mile-an-hour average. Herda and Cagle, according to the December 1963 issue of Hot Rod magazine, Herda managed a speed of 308 miles an hour before they destroyed yet another transmission and posted a recorded average speed of 296.78 miles per hour, which was well behind their newfound rivals, those boys with the Redhead. For 1964, Herda continued to evolve the machine and made a significant change. He finally ditched the T85 and put a modified Chrysler Torque Flight into the race car, and this changed the game forever. In typical Herda fashion, no stone was left unturned. They actually made a transmission cooler that used a large sealed metal box filled with ice water. The fluid circulated through it, and that kept the temperature to a workable level. The transmission was geared with a 2:45 ratio in first, a 1:45 ratio in second, and of course 1:1 in third. On a normal run, the car was pushed off, and Herda would use the push-button style shifter from a Dodge truck to engage low gear, and he'd run the car up to 5,000 RPM or 122 miles per hour. He then shift in a second at 5,000 RPM or 192 miles per hour, and he would shift in a third at 6,000 RPM, with the math saying that the motor was turning fast enough for the car to be going 230 miles an hour. From that point on, top speed was simply an exercise in how hard they wanted to turn the motor. Herda's car was subject to a Leroy Smith feature in Hot Rod magazine entitled Anatomy of a Champion, and this story espoused all the amazing features and qualities of the car. Awesomely, this car's best days were still very much ahead of it. 1964 was a tough year in the Salt. It was wet, it was windy, the event was delayed because of weather, and the course was completely unforgiving. There was a silver lining, though. The car, which now had a wing that read the Herda, Cagle, and Knapp Streamliner, was the fastest thing at Speed Week. Well, they didn't set a record, they scored top time honors, and they got the B Streamliner trophy with a 272-mile-an-hour shot. The addition of Bob Knapp was a huge add for this team. Knapp was from Palo Alto, California, had a strong engineering background, ran a large auto repair shop, and he was a hot rodder and racer to his core. This was the type of do-anything, fix-anything guy that is invaluable to have on the Salt. Cagle again provided the right power, and it seemed like the car was ready for the big time, magazine features and all. A young chassis builder from California who was also quite handy, a kid named Kent Fuller, was also a member of their team. Now, he wasn't a partner, so he didn't get his name painted on the car, but he was valuable help on the Salt. In November, they joined a small cadre of cars chasing FIA world records, and they got one, setting the flying kilometer record at 311 miles an hour for their category, and the boys just knew there was plenty left to be had out of their Streamliner. For 1965, gone was Clark Cagle, and in was a permanent partner on the car, Don Alderson, one half of the duo that formed the legendary and still successful Mylodon Company, which started as a business machining aircraft parts and transitioned into being one of the most diversified hot rod parts companies in the industry, was the new engine guy. And Don was not messing around. Alderson owned the engines, Herda owned the car, and Knapp was the guy who provided the extra set of skilled hands whenever they needed it. Once again, weather plagued Speed Week. Once again, the number of run days were shortened, the course itself was shortened to 2 miles run up and then 1/4 mile of a timing trap, and like the previous year, the car was flawless. And it was again the fastest thing on the Salt. A 272.52 mile an hour speed got them top speed of the meet, and was a warm-up act for the real show to come in November. Don Alderson's 392 based Hemi on a 30% load of nitro was just starting to sing on that short course, and the team brought back big speed honors for the second year in a row. In November, the Herda Knapp Mylodon Streamliner joined the heavy guns of land speed racing to work on setting world speed records in the FIA book. Art Arfons was there, the Goldenrod was there, and the single-engine Herda Streamliner did not disappoint. They set the Class B flying mile record at 328.887 miles per hour, and the flying kilo record was raised to 329.834 miles per hour. In the August 1966 issue of Popular Hot Rodding magazine, a feature called Bonneville's Greatest Streamliner was run. It detailed every inch of the car, even Alderson's engines. The writing was prosaic, and its praise was effusive. Said author Dave Scott, "This car and crew reflect the true spirit of hot rodding. Working without extensive factory sponsorships as other teams are, they have achieved their goals by the incorporation of common sense and good engineering. They have accomplished more with one engine, what few others have done with two or more." End quote. The detail of the story is nearly limitless. Talking about Alderson's engines, for example, Scott reveals the fact that the large Class B engine was a 462 cubic inch version of a 392 Hemi from 1957. Alderson used 9-to-1 compression, Joe Mondello ported the heads and used an Engel cam, and Don Hampton prepared the blower, making 12 psi of boost. If you note one interesting thing, Herda had designed an intake manifold to make more power with the Potvin blower drive with the supercharger out in front of the engine. Note the fact that there are 3 outlets from the supercharger feeding 3 ports on top of the engine. Now this allowed for better air distribution than the more commonly used 2-inlet setup, and details about this thing are just amazing, and those details abounded from the mind of Bob Herda. As far as their smaller engine to run in the C Streamliner class, that began as a poly-headed engine from a Chrysler Windsor. Now the block was bored 10 over, used a stock stroke, and this made for 299 cubic inches. Hemi heads from a 1955 Chrysler New Yorker were used on the same block. Mondello did the head preparation. It had a 671 blower, the same one used on the larger engine, and this one made 22 psi of boost with the smaller combination. This engine also ran on a 15% load of nitromethane. In 1966, there is little record of the car's work at Speed Week through the various sources I was able to track down, but there is a good record of a disaster of an event they had at the FIA record gathering that year. Their tow truck had wrecked a transmission on the way to the salt, which caused them to be delayed. Once they got there, they had made some alterations to the body, specifically the wheel coverings they were using. As the car roared down the salt, these alterations caused the body to distort, which began causing some lift. As Herda lifted his foot off the throttle, he found nothing. Because of the distortion of the body, the throttle was hung open. He had to shift the car into neutral, which calmed the machine down but caused the engine to run away and explode. It dumped its guts into the sealed belly of the car. It still went 327 miles per hour through the lights. Undaunted, they swapped in their C engine. Exhausted and drained, they went to the starting line, took off, suffered massive fueling and boost issues, and basically melted every valve out of the engine, ending what was mercifully a very bad attempt at the salt. 1966 was a rare bust for these guys. But remember Bob Herda, the guy of great patience. At the close of the 1966 debacle, Alderson indicated to the media that the car would be a foot narrower in 1967. Now, images don't seem to indicate that change happening, but it's very interesting that it was at least discussed. 67 will be another crowning year for the Herda Nap Milodon Streamliner. At Speed Week, they recaptured the top speed trophy after 1 year of absence. Their 329.09 mile-an-hour speed got them the new B Streamliner record as well. They had a trap speed of 347 miles per hour, cementing them once again as the fastest single-engine car in the world. But, as this had been a few years ago, Speed Week was their warm-up act. The Autolite Corporation had approached the team and they had a concept. They wanted to see the car run with a blown Ford Camry engine in it. After Speed Week, the guys went to work and made the change. Now, this had been long planned, so it wasn't like it was sprung on them at the last second. Instead of front-mounting the blower, this blower was on top of the engine and the body was modified to match its larger and taller stature. The team was poetry in motion at the FIA event. They went 357.391 miles per hour one way, bumping their single-engine record, and then averaged 345.755 miles an hour to annihilate their existing FIA records in one fell swoop. The car would take whatever was thrown at it, and the sky was apparently the limit. Bob Herda's 400-mile-per-hour dream wasn't Fantasyland anymore, it was achievable, and the team's goals were fixed on doing it, potentially doing it with a single engine. Speed Week 1968 rained out, and there was no major activity to report any later in the season either with the car. It was just one of those quiet years, and Mother Nature didn't allow much to have happen. Speed Week of 1969 would dawn with the kind of unbridled optimism that the team had earned. They had more power, they had more experience, and they had great conditions to run on. Perhaps the best they had had in years, and then everything went wrong. While ripping down the salt at nearly 300 miles per hour, a massive fire broke out in the engine area of the car. Officials surmised that fuel had been leaking and pooling under the bottom of the engine compartment, which, if you remember, was sealed to make it more aerodynamic. Inside that engine compartment was Herda's bottle of pure-breathing oxygen. If this machine had one design flaw, it was this. The intense fire, likely being drawn forward into the low-pressure area of the driver's compartment, combined with the presence of pure oxygen, created an unsurvivable inferno that Herda was trapped inside of. Smoking and flaming, the car crossed the traps at 282 miles an hour and rolled for an additional 3 miles before coming to a stop. Bob Herda, the planner, the engineer and pragmatist, the perfect operator of his perfect creation, was dead. And then it got even stranger. Upon seeing the flaming car, a local news reporter and his pilot who were covering the event took to the skies attempting to get images for the night's news report in Salt Lake City. Race officials who wanted to prevent pictures from being taken of the burned car and potentially of Herda's body as his family was present sent their own plane up to buzz the reporters out of their airspace. A bit of a dogfight with several close calls and very tense radio communications happened. The reporters at one point apparently got low enough that race officials were throwing balled-up salt at the aircraft to keep them away. It added a national news story to an already tragic situation. Now, believe it or not, the car made it through all of this. It resides in a collection, has been fully restored, and has been shown at places like the Grand National Roadster Show. It is a machine of great beauty, of great legacy, and one that carries with it the pall of a tragic ending, certainly one that no member of the land speed racing world could have foreseen coming. Bob Herda left behind a wife, 3 daughters, and a successful aeronautical engineering consulting business he had started after he left Hiller when they moved their operation to the East Coast. His death was a seismic shock to the hot rodding world. The reason that I find Bob Herda's story so compelling is that the car was a hot rod that stood alone in so many ways. Not just for looks and performance, but what it stood for. In the face of massive jet engines and 4-engine streamliners and other bombastic creations, there was this amazingly well-engineered automotive-based machine running at over 350 miles an hour. It was the elevation of hot rodding into what it could be for so many people who saw it in person or print. This was a car that hot rodders, long downtrodden by the aristocratic history of land speed chasing, could now brag on. They could be inspired by it. They could see anything was possible in a home garage with talent, a welder, vision, and most of all, patience. This story has a sad ending in so many ways, no doubt, but I choose to see the way that Bob Herda elevated hot rodding and hot rodders in such a way that it inspired generations after his to dream bigger and dream faster and find a way to do it. Just how good was the Herda Knapp Alderson Streamliner? Their single-engine speed record in their category would not be broken until the early 1990s. It stood for decades. A testament not only to how fantastic the car was, but to how lofty its accolades were. And it will forever be in land speed racing history. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more land speed, historical, automotive, and inspiring gearhead content.